Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. Peace and blessings upon you. My name is Zahir Rahman, and I'm a third-year law student. Before we begin today, the university's general counsel asked me to clarify that the Serial podcast is not involved in this event in any way. And since we're at the law school, I thought I'd probably follow his advice. On behalf of the Muslim Students Association, thank you so much for joining us. The Penn Muslim Law Students Association aims to foster the professional, spiritual, and academic development of Muslim law students and to enrich the experience for all students at the University of Pennsylvania. We hope to create a comfortable atmosphere for Muslims to practice their faith, promote spiritual development, and to further their legal education. We hope that today's event will further our mission and shed light on various issues facing the American Muslim community. I was born and raised in Baltimore, Maryland, and I was 10 years old when Adnan Syed was arrested and charged with killing Hae Min Lee, his classmate and friend at Woodlawn High School. At that time, I remember attending meetings at the Islamic Society of Baltimore, where his lawyer, Christina Gutierrez, pled with community members, explaining why she needed more money for Adnan's defense. I remember my mom and my eldest sister talking about Adnan's trial over the dinner table, with mentions of Best Buy, shady witnesses, and flimsy evidence. After Adnan's trial was over, I recall the sadness in my mom's voice when she talked about the injustice of his conviction. For my parents and for others in the community, Adnan wasn't an anomaly. Just as the state demonized Adnan's character using his ethnicity and faith, our parents feared that the same could be done to their children. Adnan's conviction inspired me to become a lawyer. Many of us felt that Adnan was unjustly framed as the stereotypical angry young Muslim male, infecting not only the jury's decision but also the judge's sentencing. A jury of one's peers did not exist for Adnan, as it would not exist for me or any of the other young Muslims from our community. The justice system had failed, and I thought that as an American Muslim, I had to one day become a lawyer, because if we didn't defend each other, then who would? Despite this strong desire to work for justice and to fight for Adnan, I and many other community members did nothing to help Adnan challenge his injustice, and he became a fleeting memory. Everyone, that is, except for Rabia Chaudry. Unlike the rest of us, Ms. Chaudry never forgot Adnan and never gave up on his case. Indeed, she is the one that never left his side, and she is the one that brought Adnan's case to Sarah Koenig and the Serial team. We are very honored and privileged to welcome Ms. Rabia Chaudry to campus. Ms. Chaudry is the president of the Safe Nation Collaborative, a National Security Fellow at the New America Foundation, and a senior CVE Countering Violent Extremism consultant. Before serving in these capacities, she was a practicing attorney with experience in immigration law, civil liberties, and national security. Though even before Serial, Ms. Chaudry was well known among activist circles for her work on behalf of American Muslims. On top of her own personal workload, every week as a new Serial episode was released, Ms. Chaudry provided much-needed commentary and additional evidence to complement the podcast on her blog, Split the Moon. Although during the Serial season, Split the Moon had many legal and analytical highlights, one of my favorite posts was entitled Meta to the Max. She writes, "In the few months after Adnan had first been arrested, he told me of a dream he had in jail while awaiting trial. He dreamt that he was on a mountain that rose high in front of him, and he saw Hae climbing it, with her back to him. He called out to her, but she didn't turn back. So he started following her up the mountain, trying to get her attention in vain. That's how his dream ended, with him climbing higher and higher to try and reach her. Adnan thought that his dream was a reflection of his pain at her death, of not knowing what happened to her, of trying to speak to her one last time to find out. In my heart, as he told me, I thought the dream sounded ominous. It seemed like he was going to get lost to the world like Hae did, climbing up and away after her, leaving the world behind. I didn't tell him that. Instead, I tried to comfort him. Indeed, it is because of her persistent, unwavering advocacy that Adnan's case is still alive, and our community owes her the highest gratitude for maintaining hope, never giving up, and dedicating her life to service. Please join me in giving Ms. Rabia Chaudry a warm welcome to Penn Law.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much. That's like, you almost made me cry, but I'm not quite there yet. Maybe later today. First of all, I want to thank you so much, Zahir, for inviting me, for the Muslim Student Association at UPenn Law, for hosting this, for all of you to taking time out of your incredibly busy schedules, as I know the year is winding down, to come and hear about Adnan's case and to talk about the case and to talk about the show. I'm going to start off by asking all of you to smile for me, because as I'm doing these events across the country, I like to take pictures and send them to Adnan so that he knows how many people are still paying attention. So everybody smile. I'm going to start from this side. All right? Okay. In the center. All right. That will also be later tweeted today. My handle is Rabia squared. Okay. So, every time, I could just like ad hoc speak about Adnan's case, Serial, the last 6 months, the last 16 years for hours on end. But obviously, with different groups, you want to talk about different things. When I was first asked to speak here, I thought, oh, this will be interesting. I've spoken to Muslim student associations and I've spoken to law students. This will be the first time I'm speaking to a Muslim student association at a law school. So for a number of weeks in my mind, I had this like very kind of religiously oriented, faith-centered talk that I was going to give. And then I was told there's like 4 of us here. So I was like, all right, let's back that up. So I will address you as law students, and I can promise you most of you in here are much smarter than me and are going to accomplish a lot more than I ever have. I'm lucky I got out of law school, and I'm lucky that I passed the bar exam. Now, in my defense, I was working full-time, and I was the mother of a little girl, and I was in a very traditional Pakistani marriage with 10 in-laws living with me. So yeah, I'm really lucky I got out of law school at the time. So let me tell you, when Adnan was arrested in 1999, I was a law student, and I was the closest thing that the community had to an actual Muslim lawyer, I think. I don't know if there was anybody else going to law school at the time. And I was the rebel who, after 3 years of pre-med, said to my parents, I'm so sorry to destroy your dreams, but I'm going to go to law school. And that was a big blow because people just didn't do that back then. And I'm so glad they're doing it now. I'm so glad that there are, that we're finally diversifying, Muslims in second, third generation, immigrant Muslims especially are finally diversifying the fields they're going into. But back then I was it. So when Adnan was arrested, I didn't get directly involved with the case. I was just somebody that the family started to lean on because they said, listen, can you help explain to us what's happening? Can you tell us what is going to happen? What are the possible outcomes? What do we do with Gutierrez? How do we deal? Can you be an intermediary between us and Gutierrez? Because you're like the closest thing to somebody who has legal knowledge. And I didn't know what I was doing. So for the first year when Adnan was denied bail, he sat awaiting trial in prison, and I just was there as a support, we wrote letters. In fact, I have a letter here that was from Adnan. I'm going to read a portion of it in a little bit. He wrote this a few days after he was actually convicted. So it was a year after he'd been arrested. And in it, he actually says that the first letter I got when I was arrested, Rabia, was yours. So that was like my role, to be there as like a big sister, because he was like a little brother to me. He still is. And it wasn't until the second trial, there was a first trial in December of 99, which I didn't attend because I was taking law school finals. It lasted 3 days and ended in a mistrial. The second trial lasted about 6 weeks, January and February of 2000. That's the trial I sat through. That's the trial in which I actually got to see and meet Gutierrez and try to meet with her through the family, and understand what was actually happening in the case. Until then, I didn't even know what the evidence against Adnan was. I didn't know what the theory of the state's case was. I knew nothing. And Adnan didn't know a lot. Gutierrez didn't know a lot. She wasn't even given access to the police statements of their primary witness until about, I think, the day before the first trial or something ridiculous like that. So we didn't know what was going to be coming at him at all. But for me, even though I think I was in my second year of law school at the time, that was my actual first real encounter with the law. I hate to break it to you, law school's great. Law school is not anything like practicing law at all. You're going to come out of here knowing how to argue, make great arguments, and analyze things, but it's going to take being, in practice to really understand what the law is about. So my first real encounter with the law was sitting through that trial and just being horrified. I didn't have to be a legal expert to understand that things were not going right here. I didn't have to be a legal expert to understand that for the state to spend hours and hours of time talking about Adnan's religion and ethnicity was wrong. I didn't have to be an expert to understand how the optics of that room were looking for Adnan. Here's the community, like Zahir's parents and others, many other elders who came. Because one thing we have to remember is Adnan's peers didn't attend the trial. His friends weren't there. They were in school, right? Everybody's in school. And then people from the Muslim community, even if their kids could, they discouraged their kids from attending the trial. They didn't want their kids anywhere close to it because they were scared. They didn't know what this meant. We come from cultures, South Asians come from cultures, where there is nothing more inherently corrupt than the judicial system and police. Okay? There's a lot of fear. My family's from Pakistan, and I've done a lot of asylum work on cases from Pakistan, and that involve police corruption, that involve institutional practices like physical remand, which means in Pakistan, if you're arrested by the police, they don't have to charge you for 90 days. 90 days they have something called physical remand. They have physical control of your body in order to torture a confession out of you and get evidence. They can pick up your relatives to do the same thing. So these are the kinds of places that our families came from where you don't go to the police. You are afraid of the police. You are afraid of courts. You know that unless you pay off the right people or have the right connections, you're not going to get justice. So this is the background from which our community, and this was the first encounter our community ever had with a criminal judge. Nobody had ever been arrested before from that community. Am I right? Right. I don't know if anybody's been arrested since. In fact, no. So in many, many ways, a very naive community because our parents were immigrants. They just came. They wanted to work, send their kids to school, and that was it. But you know, these are the aunties and the uncles, as we call them, who fill the courtroom, who sat behind Adnan to support him. And they were there with their beards and their shawls, looking very foreign, looking very scary, looking very much like the other. The lessons I learned in that trial, I have carried throughout my practice with me. And it completely turned me off from wanting to go into criminal law. I didn't know at that point what I wanted to practice, actually. That summer I did an internship at a corporate litigation firm, and I thought, no, I need to be able to talk to people and not look at papers, but I wasn't sure. And I was actually offered an internship at the DA's office in D.C. I'm sorry, at the public defender's office in D.C. that summer too. And I didn't do it, and I didn't do it for a number of reasons, but one of them was because I was terrified after sitting through the trial. I was scared because I realized what a tremendous, not burden, but duty, that all the parties to a criminal proceeding especially, but really in lots of different facets of law, but specifically to a criminal proceeding have. Now from an Islamic faith perspective, this is something that we call an amana, which is like a trust, that you have been entrusted with something major. And what we see oftentimes is that we judge whether the prosecutors and the cops and defense counsel, did they meet like a certain level of duty? Did they fulfill their duty? And that has become our standard. Like, did they just do enough? That can't be our standard when you have the life of somebody at stake, right? Doing enough is not good enough. Doing enough should not get you, should not be the standard. You have to do the best you can. And in this whole system, what I learned was that if just one of the parties had done the best they could, whether it was the police, if they had done a real investigation, a full investigation, whether it was the prosecutors, if they had really taken a look at what evidence was before them, really thought about how they were framing the case in terms of an honor killing, which was really manipulative, whether those parties had done their job, Adnan might not ever have actually been charged with the crime. But the buck stops with the defense counsel, who has the greatest burden and the greatest duty here, who is supposed to keep in line all these other systematic failures that might happen. And this is the person who is your advocate, right? Like when we think of advocacy, we think about people marching the streets and fighting with passion. Lawyers are advocates. We're supposed to be advocates. What does that mean? What does that look like? It doesn't look like anything that happened in his trial for lots of different reasons. Let me just ask quickly. I'm assuming everybody heard the podcast. Yes? Raise your hands, everybody heard the podcast. Okay, almost there. There's a few people, shame on you. That's okay, I'll give you some time. Where the heck have you been for 6 months? But, okay, how many people since the podcast ended, and I won't be angry at you, but have actually been reading my blog? Oh, well, dang. Okay. How many people have read or heard of Susan Simpson's blog? Okay, there's like 3 or 4 people. Okay. So, let me just tell you, first of all, what you heard in Serial is a very small part of the story. Serial was a great, great narrative. It was compelling. It was masterfully done. Sarah is brilliant. I give her mad props. I would do podcasts really badly, probably, but she's really great. But she's not necessarily an investigator, and she's also not a lawyer, and nobody on her team is. So, as she was doing the podcast, I would fill in on my blog, but even me, I'm one of those people who, I'll look at documents, I'll say something is really wrong here, but I can't quite figure out what it is and articulate it, because I'm also not an investigator. And I don't have experience with criminal defense, or sitting through, depositions and other things because of the path that my career took. Or understanding what's happening in a police interview, right? So there's an attorney named Susan Simpson who's in DC, and she's kind of a law geek. She blogs on the law and has blogged for years. And she writes about all kinds of like weird maritime rules that nobody cares about. She's a real geek. She just stumbled across the show and got really interested in the case and started reading my blog. And on my blog, I would release transcripts and things. And she's like a Sherlock. She's like a real life Sherlock. She started breaking down like what was actually happening in these documents. She started pulling out the gaps that nobody, not the lawyers, not Sarah Koenig, not even me, had identified. And she found all kinds of evidentiary issues and facts that have been overlooked all this time, even by Serial. For example, the idea that Hae was buried around 7 or 8 p.m. Right. Now, for those of you who, after Serial, heard Jay's interview, where he kind of flips the entire timeline and says, well, he buried her on 12, what Susan Simpson discovered by looking at the autopsy report, she said, wait a minute, there's something going on here, because this girl, she was found buried on her right side, but she has a condition called lividity, which means all the blood pools to one part of the body after a person dies, and that's all on the anterior. That's what this report says. That doesn't happen. It doesn't fix that way for at least 10. You have to be in the same position for 10 hours for that to happen. So Hae Min could not have been buried 3 or 4 hours after she was killed, 7 to 8 p.m., on her right side, because her lividity would have been on her right side. She was somewhere flat on her face for about 10 hours before she was buried. Where was she? This is major, right? This is kind of major. It totally throws the theory of the state's case out. The point is, even after all these years, there's all these things that we missed, right? And procedurally, you're gonna experience this if you litigate. You can't bring up stuff whenever you want to, right? We have a post-conviction hearing coming up, but we can't suddenly say, by the way, we have some new stuff. By the way, you have to wait. You have to wait. You have to wait for certain procedural points at which you can raise new issues, and that makes things hard. It makes things really hard for people who are not like Adnan, especially. Adnan is actually quite blessed. He's lost 16 years of his life, but he has a family who never forgot him. He has people who send him money. He has people who visit him. He has people he can call and talk to. And Adnan has encountered in his 16 years people who have been completely forgotten. In 20 years, they've never had a visitor. That when they die, there's nobody to call, for the institution to call. And we know that any given time, there are about 20,000 wrongful convictions. But it doesn't have to necessarily be somebody who's in there because of a wrongful conviction. Even people who are in there who are rightfully convicted are still human beings, right? But a lot of them don't have the resources. They don't have the money to fight in courts. They don't have the years and years and the people sticking by them all those years. So in that way, Adnan is blessed. So, some of the lessons that I took, the most important lesson I took from all my experience at that trial, was to always make my client the center of my world for their case. I had to imagine what it was like to be in their shoes. Now, I practiced immigration for most of my career, which doesn't seem like it's a big deal, but it's a big deal for people. Because if they're deported, they could be the sole provider for 10 people back home, right? If they get their immigration, they could literally change their future generations. Undocumented workers are exploited in ways that nobody even realizes. If you're an undocumented woman and you're abused by somebody, sexually or abused, or if you're assaulted, likelihood is that you're not going to call the police because people are afraid, you know? So the issues that immigrants face are serious issues. And when you're representing them, even though it seems like it's just some paperwork, these are impacting not just that person's life, but their families and even maybe generations ahead. So I always ask myself the question, what would I do for this person if this person was my brother or my sister? And I've always believed in quality over quantity. Immigration is one of those fields where if you want to strike it rich, and I am not rich, if you want to strike it rich, you have to do quantity. You have to take lots and lots of cases. And I never did that because I knew what that would mean for my clients. And I've always done about 20% pro bono work. And this is all because I saw what the impact that trial has on a person's life and on their family's life. Now, interestingly enough, in the last 6 or 7 months, as hard as I've fought for Adnan's story to be known, I have myself been so wrapped up in being the public face for him because he's asked me to, that I have had very little time to actually engage with Adnan. The last time I saw him was in October or late September. I'm going to see him this weekend, and it's been a long time. I speak to him not that maybe once or twice a month for like 15 minutes where we're like, okay, the private investigator has like these questions and I need to know, and there's very little like human engagement anymore, like he's like somebody that I care about. And I thought about this a lot for the last couple of weeks because I miss him. And I'm tired that, you know, I'm doing all of this because it's important for his case, but again, he's being lost. To me, he wasn't part of the serial story. He certainly didn't have a voice in his trial. That's another thing we have to remember. If you're going to go into criminal defense, first of all, I totally don't believe in innocent until proven guilty. I believe that's a legal fiction. When you are shuffling in and out of court in shackles and handcuffs and in jumpsuits, you are guilty. When you are behind bars with general population, you are guilty. You're being treated as a guilty person. And oftentimes that person is never going to have a voice. They will never be even heard in the courtroom, and they are completely at the mercy of all these people who are going to decide what's going to happen for the rest of their lives. So anyhow, I thought that what I would do is, and I brought this letter, and I haven't done this very much. I just did it once, in fact, one other talk last night at Swarthmore. I read a portion of Adnan's letter, because I feel more and more that his voice needs to be heard. This was again written, he was 18 years old. He had been convicted within 2 hours. The jury had returned their verdict. And he wrote this letter within a week after the conviction. He actually still had not been transferred to the prison. He was being held in a jail in the city until they decided where they were going to put him, I guess. And this is one portion where he writes that, I've learned that things get a lot better with time. Now, at this point, he had been in jail for about a year. The edge is dull, and after a while, pretty much everything gets better. Alhamdulillah, which means praise be to God or thank God. There's so much I can do with my life. It's not worth worrying about what I can't do. And the fact is, it's still not over. There's so much about my case and situation to lay back and not put up a fight. I don't think I had a fair trial in the way the judge limited us in presenting evidence and the way the prosecutors handled it. I believe that if God wanted me to spend the rest of my life in here, he wouldn't have left so many openings to me. I have a lot of faith that one day I have a lot of faith that one day I will get the chance to tell my story. And I'm going to do it right this time. And even if it doesn't work, then it's still not over. I know a guy in here who received a double life sentence. He's been fighting it for 15 years. And his most recent time in court, it got dropped down to 60 years. And Adnan thinks this is a good thing, by the way, you know. He's like, yay, 60 years. God willing, I won't have to fight that long. But God is preparing me for pretty much anything. Well, he has fought that long, and it's been even longer. In fact, it's been 16 years now. I feel that we are much closer to bringing him home. I feel like we're getting closer and closer to his exoneration. I apologize for my weepiness. This is that personal to me, you know. And in a lot of cases, it has to be that personal to somebody, to keep connected to somebody who is in this position. Because if you don't care that much, then they're not going to come home. 2 days ago, and I'm going to end here because I know we have questions and moderated discussion. 2 days ago, in Baltimore City, a man who was convicted in 1999, wrongfully convicted in 1994, of murdering his girlfriend, he was exonerated in February of this year in Baltimore. 2 days ago, he filed a lawsuit against the Baltimore City Police, in which he alleges that there was actual tampering of forensic evidence. 2 of the detectives named in his lawsuit are the detectives in Adnan's case. The forensic expert who's named in the lawsuit was the forensic expert in Adnan's case. The point is that things are unraveling, I think, for the state. And what we know is that the legal community is paying attention. Judges are listening. Law clerks are listening. I was speaking at one law school and in Baltimore, and one of the state's highest prosecutors was there. I went to another event, and an attorney from the Attorney General's office in Maryland was there. They're really paying attention. And so this is also a lesson, as if you advocate for clients, that sometimes there's a time to make that advocacy public. There's a time to leverage, like, you know, we don't even need mainstream media anymore. That's what social media is for. You can create your own stories. And a lot of this is about storytelling. What happens in a courtroom is about storytelling. You tell the story right, people will come away, given the same exact facts, with completely different conclusions. So these are skills as lawyers that I want, you know, I hope you use. I'm sure you will use. And thanks for coming. And I guess that's it for me.
Thank you so much, Rabia, for sharing all of that with us. At this time, I wanted to get the moderated Q&A started. And one thing that I wanted to ask you about that I was particularly interested in when I was listening to the Serial podcast was this emphasis on the double life that Adnan was leading, where on one hand, he's a practicing Muslim and he's an active member of his community and he attends the mosque and gets good grades. And then on the other hand, he has this, you know, double life where he's doing quote unquote bad things and his family doesn't know about it. And a lot of people who listened to the Serial podcast thought that, well, if this kid is able to pull off this double life so successfully, then maybe he did commit this crime and he's capable of putting up this pretense the entire time. But when I was listening to it as an American Muslim who was born and raised here, and, you know, my parents are immigrants, to me it sounded relatively normal to not, you know, to have a little bit of duality in your life. So I wanted to get your thoughts on how the podcast presented that and how much weight you gave that issue.
I mean, look, the state's entire theory of the motive of the crime was that it was an honor killing. First of all, honor killings don't work like that. But second, you know, I mean, you know, who cares about facts? Was that it was an honor killing. And it was linked directly to not just his ethnicity and his religion, but that he was able to nefariously, you know, fake out his parents and have a girlfriend and smoke pot. And I remember thinking at the time, and I was a married woman, I had a daughter at the time. I was married very young, and I was like, dang, we are all screwed if this is the case, because this is like the life of most immigrant kids. It's also the life of a lot of teenagers in general. Now, what this is called bigotry, because when you take a certain set of circumstances or facts, and you attribute different motivations for them depending on that person's race, then that is bigotry, okay? We see this a lot of times. We'll see this, like, for example, even in terrorism cases where if a perp is a white man who's not a Muslim, then we're like, well, mental health, you know, financial issues, wife left him. There's all, you know, and the media does this, but as soon as if it's a Muslim perp, I mean, there is an over-prosecution of Muslims. If you are a Muslim who has been charged with terrorism, you are going to be convicted and you are going to get the maximum sentence. There's just no other way around it. Because we already attribute certain things. We do this to young black men. We do this to young Muslim men. And that's what happened in this case, is that they took something that was totally normal, and very understandable if you just explained it to people, And the state, used that against him. And I think Uric is smarter than that. I think Uric knew exactly what he was doing. Uric had to take this young man who had no history of violence, right? Had no criminal history, and be like, how do I make him look bad? What do I have to work with? Oh, his religion. I have his religion to work with. And they worked with it, and it worked. The jury, like you said, was not a jury of his peers. We have to remember, even lawyers need cultural competency, even juries. You have to think about these things. That what does it look like to the jury? What does it look like to the judge? To consider your clients, all these things related to your client, their ethnicity, their background, what they look like even. I think the way Sarah handled it in Serial, it's always hard to tell with Sarah. You never know if she's authentically like, I wonder, or if that's her way of drawing out the story. And when she presented, they mentioned it in the podcast, there was like a 8 or 10 page memo on the Islamic culture that was discovered. Sarah discovered it in the police files. I had never seen it. Defense counsel we had never had it. She brought it to me a few months before the podcast launched, and she said, can you look at this and can you tell me what you think? And I just sat there, like my blood pressure rising. I'm like, oh my God, this is ridiculous. And there was a particular part which really horrified me, that said that if a Muslim man gives a young woman a scarf as a gift, or gives a woman a scarf as a gift, it means he now owns her. So I read this, and I actually was reading it out loud. I'm like, what? If a Muslim man? And Sarah goes, wait a minute, are you saying that's not true? And I'm like, oh my God, just kill me now. So I realized like what a big mountain there was to climb. I think Sarah did and I was on her. I said, you have to bring this issue up. You have to bring the issue up. There's no reason in a state level homicide case for the words Pakistan, Islam, and Muslim to be brought up 270 times in a trial. This was not about that, right? So she did it. I'm glad she brought it up. I think she did what she did with a lot of issues, is she left it inconclusive. Maybe there was bigotry and maybe there wasn't. But if you were Muslim or you were South Asian, Indian, Bengali, Desi as they call it, you knew it. When you heard it, you're like, that's crap. That's not true. None of that's true. And the South Asian Bar Association was paying attention. The National South Asian Bar Association reached out to me when they heard this, and they said, this is ridiculous, we want to write an amicus in your case and support you. So we turned over the transcripts to them. Procedurally, they couldn't file the amicus, so they did a really great op-ed in the Baltimore Sun, which is where I wanted it so the local judges could see it. So, you have to be on the receiving end to know it. But I have to say to people, look, if you are not the target of bigotry, like just believe the people who are, right? If somebody says this is racist against me, just believe it. It would be really, it would just make things easier for us. So anyway, right there.
So, I mean, just to feed off of that question a little bit. So, a lot of people, we talk a lot about Islamophobia today, and a lot of it is a result of 9/11, what's happened since. But can you give us maybe some other context to understanding in 1999 what that looks like, and how you kind of said how it's played in the trial, but just in general, even people like my generation of students and even young Muslims who I've talked to, they're like, Islamophobia didn't happen until after 9/11. Before 9/11, people didn't know about Muslims, but they did not like them.
Yeah, I think it was. Let me think. 1989. I was sitting with my little brother and sister and best friend on the beach in Ocean City, eating a Burger King sandwich. And a group of men who were like in their 40s came to us, and we were just kids sitting on a bench, and they said, hey, you bunch of sand niggers. And the Iraq War, I mean, they were like, a Saddam, your uncle. I was like, what is going on? I didn't even understand what was happening in the world. I was too young to know it was but believe me, this stuff existed. I mean, the whole dynamic of the Muslim man and woman, like back in the 90s, was like set by that movie, Not Without My Daughter. Does anybody remember that? You guys might be too young to remember that. I think it was Sally Hansen did this movie called Not Without My Daughter. It was based on a story of a woman who marries an Iranian man, and they have a kid, and he goes to Iran, and he takes the kid, and then she spends the whole time fighting him to get her child back, Not Without My Daughter. And, so even beyond that, I mean, there have been studies about the depictions of Muslims in Hollywood, like, from the earliest films and even movie posters. It's very stereotypical. You have this guys in a turban, baggy pants, hooked nose, with like 4 burqa'd women behind him. These stereotypes existed. The World Trade Center had already been attacked once. We had been through, Saddam Hussein. It was there. What didn't happen until 9/11 was that Muslims did not have an organized response necessarily. We hadn't articulated yet what this phenomenon was, that Islamophobia is a thing, or anti-Muslim bigotry is a thing. We were just like flailing and saying, oh my God, this sucks, it's not right. But after 9/11 is when we were able to name it and do something about it. Not that it's necessarily helped. What's been interesting though is that even though right now statistically, like anti-Muslim sentiment is quite high in this country, we rank really low, like below atheists and I think serial killers or I don't know what, but we're really, really low on the totem pole in terms of groups that people like. But when Serial brought this issue up, that this potentially maybe was an honor killing related to his faith, overwhelmingly the response from people was like, that's ridiculous. Oh, that's ridiculous. That was wrong. The state shouldn't have done that prosecution. And I was really heartened to hear that was a response, that people just rejected it outright. They didn't buy that theory.
So you discussed this a little bit earlier, but I wanted to ask you about the representation that Cristina Gutierrez provided Adnan, and in your opinion, what you thought of it, and if you thought the podcast was overly critical of her or overly lenient, or if there's anything that you experienced with her personally that you think should have been addressed in it.
I think Sarah was really easy on Gutierrez. Gutierrez, I understand she was really sick towards the end of her time practicing. She was experiencing lots of financial difficulties, but you know what? She shouldn't have been practicing. You shouldn't take work if you cannot fulfill your obligations. I was, during the trial, thinking things like, oh my God, if a law student could do this better. Because she was rambling, she wouldn't hit her points, her cross-examinations would go on for so long that over and over, if you look at the transcript, the judge is like, can we wrap this up? How much more time do you need? There were times when witnesses were like, I don't know what you're asking me. Now, I'm guessing this was like directly related to her decreasing cognitive ability because she had MS and apparently she also had cancer. She was struggling badly. We didn't know that. Nobody knew that. Now, her colleagues should have known that. The people who had seen her in court for 30 years should have known something. This is not Gutierrez, as we know. But nobody said anything. 28 complaints against Gutierrez. There were 28 client complaints against Gutierrez with the Attorney Grievance Commission, which broke all the records in Maryland. No attorney had ever had that many complaints against them. The Attorney Grievance Commission has a fund that they pay to reimburse. It broke the bank. They emptied out the bank. She agreed to be disbarred. These are all signs that she was not competent during those final years. That should be enough for a court to say, we have to go back and look at these cases. We shouldn't have to prove that she didn't contact a potential alibi witness. And we can go on and on about the value of Asia as a witness, but in a he said, she said trial where there is no physical evidence and you have Jay Wiles versus Asia McClain, she could have been all we needed. She might not have been, but the point is, Cristina had to at least contact her. You cannot not contact an alibi witness when the entire case is just based on one person's testimony, which actually keeps changing. Right? There's no physical evidence she had to deal with. She didn't hire any experts. She should have hired medical experts, forensic experts, cell phone experts. She hired none of it. The state's case lasted about 6 weeks. On Thursday, Cristina, I remember of that week, it was either Wednesday evening or Wednesday afternoon or Thursday. I think it was Thursday morning. Cristina began the defense, and by Friday morning she rested. It lasted a day. Her defense lasted a day. She didn't call any of the witnesses we wanted her to call. She called these people from the school to read letters about, Adnan's, there's a letter of recommendation written for his school. That had nothing to do with, there were witnesses who were like, I saw him at the mosque the night before. She failed to establish where he was that day. So that's what I think of Gutierrez's representation. I could go on. But Adnan deserves another trial just based on that.
So I'm going to ask one more question, and then we're going to open up for open Q&A at the 2 mics here. So if anyone has a question, they can start getting in line. One of the things that after the podcast, you and a couple other people started the Launch Good Defense Fund for Adnan, and currently it has over $91,000. to put that in perspective, like, there's that story of that man that walked 21 miles back and forth from Detroit, and within 3 days, they had raised $250,000. While I was listening to the Serial podcast, all was going through my mind is that people are going to give so much money to Adnan. Like I thought that like this is going to be it. People are going to give so much money. So given the huge success, given the fact that like, there was the Reddit, there seemed to be a lot of people who, at the very least, they could recognize that Adnan wasn't given a fair share and that there was a serious miscarriage of justice in his case and that would want to give money towards his defense fund. What do you think about the 91,000? Do you think that you're on course with what you were expecting? Did you expect more? And what do you plan on doing with the money?
Okay, so our goal was $250,000 because we thought in terms of, number one, you lose a good chunk to like taxes, okay, and then we plan for if there would be, because look, whoever wins in June, it's going to be appealed again. It's going to go to the highest court of the land in Maryland. So we're going to, if we lose, we're going to appeal. If they lose, they're going to appeal. That's just almost a given. So we're looking at another couple of years worth of legal work at least. If we go to trial again, I can't imagine the state would say, yes, we'll try this case again, but you never know. Okay? And then private investigators, we're also thinking of offering reward money in certain circumstances, although that's debatable about like whether it be helpful or not. But the point is, we thought $250K is like, we'd raise it like that. One of his attorneys was like, actually his attorneys from the bail hearing, Chris Floor, who is now back in the case working with us, was like, oh, we'll like raise $1 million, I'm pretty sure. I was like, well, we don't need $1 million. Like, we don't need all that money. Like, $250K is more than enough we need. So in that respect, it was disappointing that that we raised about $92K. Part of it, I think, was the fact that we didn't start till after Serial ended. I was like a zombie for those, like, I was like, I can't wait till this is over. Cause I was just like exhausted. Thursday it would drop. I would spend all day Thursday thinking about it. I would be up all night writing about it. Friday was Friday would be my blog. I have fielded maybe 500 media interviews in this time, from Australia to Japan to UK to Ireland to wherever. I mean, I was like on Irish public radio, And people are like, Adnan. I'm like, the fact that people are saying Adnan and Rabia, like it's like, Joe and Smith, it's like weird to me. Every Monday I did a live Google Hangout about it. Like, I was like crazy, basically, and I had no volunteer team. People think like there's like a team no, it was like me. And so it wasn't until it was winding down that this one, guy he's an attorney, he's part of the trust now, was like, listen, you should start fundraising. And I'm like, oh, that's a good idea. We should start fundraising. And so, and it took time to get it set up, because a lot of the crowdsourcing sites won't allow fundraising for specific people like this unless it's a nonprofit. So having said all that, I am still incredibly thankful and grateful. We have like almost, I think, 900 people who donated. We have close to 100K that we didn't have a year ago. I mean, I can't complain about that. It might be that we don't need any more than that. Because this is not about just making money for the sake of making money. It's about just paying for his defense. We have a private investigator right now who is, following some leads that, if they are confirmed, could literally just lead to a straight up exoneration of Adnan, okay? If that happens, we're not looking at years worth of litigation. We better not be, at least. I'm watching you, State of Maryland. We better not be. I'm gonna like jump on them until they let him go. But if I have a feeling if we did need more, we'd be able to do the fundraising. One thing we haven't done now, our community raised over $100,000 when he was arrested. Like, just the local community. If we needed to go back to the communities, because this was all done online, I'm sure we could do that.
That's true. So if you're gonna rearrange.
Yeah, I'm gonna have a seat now and I'll answer questions from there. That's okay. All right, so go ahead. Doesn't sound like it.
Do I have to press something?
It's on.
Oh, it's on. Okay. I am not a law student, and my question might betray that, so I'm sorry if this is an inappropriate question to ask. But I remember from the podcast that there was some reluctance on Adnan's part, probably for good reason, to offer an alternate theory of what happened on air, and I was just wondering if you might be able to provide an alternate theory of what happened.
Do you want me to provide an alternate theory of what I think happened or what I think Adnan thinks happened?
Both, please.
So, I can't do both. And the reason I can't do both is because in Adnan's position, he's in a supermax facility with some people who are like, you know, actually dangerous people. It's not the kind of place where you want to be thought of as somebody who spouts off about another person, like, at all, right? Like, you just don't want to be in that position. I know what Adnan thinks happened, but I don't want to put it out there. Now, what I think happened is that, I think there are two real possibilities. One is that Jay knew nothing, absolutely nothing, and that the police fed him certain information, because that would account for all the weirdness in Jay's statements. They keep changing. You know, when Jay first told the police, yeah, I'll take you to the car, he took him to the wrong location. You know, there's some real oddities in, that could be that Jay himself is kind of a erratic person. I don't know. I don't know him like that. That's one possibility. That, and in that case, it would be a third suspect that not long before Hae was killed, another young Asian girl from Woodlawn was killed, and her body was found in the same location. It should shock the conscience of everybody that there's been physical evidence that was taken from Hae's body that was never tested for DNA. Why didn't the police do that? Why didn't the prosecutor do that? Gutierrez did nothing, but why didn't the state do that? You know, what were they afraid of? Because they had tested what they found, like the fibers in the hair, and it was negative for Adnan. They tore up his car. They tore up his house. They tested his boots, his clothes, everything they could find. They didn't do any of that for Jay. So it could be that they didn't want to get the forensic tested for DNA because they didn't know what they would find. So that's one theory, is that Jay knows almost nothing, but Jay was a convenient way to convict Adnan. The other theory is that somebody close to Jay is actually responsible for Hae's death. Hae was dressed very nicely that day. She was wearing a black skirt and heels, and that's how she was found, in fact. So it seemed like she might have been going to see either Dawn, or she was going to work dressed like that. And she told a number of people at school that I have something to do, and she didn't say what. Hae did smoke weed, like a lot of the kids did. It's entirely possible she went to go pick something up from somewhere and just ended up at the wrong place at the wrong time, and that's possible. And when I think about the way Jay is afraid, like he tends to have a fear, it could be somebody that and there are people who are connected to Jay, that are the kind of people that make sense for him to be scared of. I'll put it like that. If you read Susan Simpson's blog, she explains it a little bit further. So those are my two theories. Either that Jay knows nothing or Jay knows who did it. I used to think for 16 years that Jay was responsible. I don't think that so much anymore. So, are there any other questions? If you can come to the mic, that'd be great.
On the podcast, Adnan says that he is living a life, but it's not the life that he imagined. What does he mean by this? And also, why is he in Supermax?
I'll start with the second question first. Adnan used to be housed at Jessup, in a prison in Jessup, Maryland, that was actually quite relaxed. It was the kind of place where, like, the guards were very easygoing, and there weren't a lot of rules, and there's a lot of Muslims incarcerated there, so he had a kind of a community. He makes friends anywhere he goes anyways. He's very, like, kind of likable and easygoing and non-aggressive. And he used to work at the law library there, and the librarian would give him documents or boxes to go put in her car, and he would go do that. He would literally be outside of the prison, like in the parking lot. And then he would just turn around and walk back in. Like, it was that kind of facility. They closed that prison because of, I think, what I understand is overcrowding, and then there were some corruption issues too. And they took all people who had life sentences and moved them to Supermax. So it became an issue of just overcrowding. Like, there's not enough space to house these people together, so how do we decide who goes where? So they took all the lifers. So it wasn't just him alone. It was him and anybody else with a life sentence. They moved it to Cumberland, Maryland, in the Supermax. And it's very far away. Jessup was close enough that we could pop by every week, like 15, 20 minutes from his parents. This is like over 3 hours. It's like 3 hours away. The thing about having a life, Adnan has always had an attitude of gratefulness, and That's just who he is. I mean, I have a daughter who's like 17, almost 18, and I know what teenagers are like, and I'm like, okay, he's just kind of a remarkable person. This letter that I read to you, he was 18 at the time, and he had just been convicted. He hadn't been sentenced yet, but he knew what was coming. He knew he was going to get life in prison. And he says over and over and over in this letter, thank you, I thank God, I thank my community, he's just that kind of person. So when he talks about his prison situation, over the years he said things like, listen, I'm blessed because there are so many people in here who have nobody, right? He also says, I'm lucky to be in an American prison, think about people who are like in a Syrian prison or an Egyptian prison or all these horrible places around the world. He's like, he's taken every class possible. He's received every certification available. Like he's hit the limit. There's nothing else he can take. He's memorized the entire Quran in Arabic and this English translation. Like he's done a lot. He's a productive person. So when he says he has a life, that's what he means. He wants to he wants to open a bakery if he ever gets out, He likes to cook. He does things. So that's what he means when he says he has a life. Part of it is that this is his personality, and I think also part of it is that for people he loves, he will never tell them the pain that he might actually be in. So this is what we always hear, me, his family, my brother.
I was wondering if you've had any contact with Hae Min Lee's family or how they've reacted to the podcast or his potential exoneration.
No, we never had contact. It was just the most difficult situation during the trial because her family would be there. And on one hand, it's like you want to reach out and tell them that you feel their pain because at the end of the day, like it's like the worst nightmare any parent can experience. But we just couldn't do it. It was hard for Adnan because he knew her family, he knew her brother, he was friends with him, and he was precluded from talking to them even. So after all those, as years went by, what we were told was that they had moved. We didn't know if they were out of the country, nobody knew where they were. Sarah tried really hard to find them. She could not locate them. Once the podcast launched and Reddit, there was a subreddit that popped up on the Reddit site. Hae's brother actually posted. And he said that, I'm following this. It's not entertainment. It's, a real life. But it sounded like he was saying that, he's following the podcast and what's happening. So he's allowing for the possibility that maybe what they thought happened didn't actually happen. And when Adnan was first arrested and Hae's family was told, they actually said, we just don't believe it because they knew Adnan. What happened recently was Colin Miller is another professor. He's a law professor who writes about the case from the evidentiary aspects of it. In one of his blogs, Hae Min's brother also comments. Like so he's actually following. They're paying attention. They are, I'm assuming he's reading my blog, Susan's blog, Colin's, but Colin writes about, whether the windshield wiper was broken or the turn signal was broken in her car, because that was part of Jay's testimony. And Hae's brother actually comments under the blog saying that I remember driving her car home after the police released it and the turn signal didn't work. And I was a new driver and so I was scared to drive it, so my grandfather drove it home. So they're plugged in, but I don't know where they are. And we have to be careful. I can't be reaching out to people because you don't want ever there to be an allegation that because just they reached out, like somebody's feeling pressured, So you have to kind of maintain a distance.
So I was wondering, first, two questions. One is, could you talk a little bit about the legal strategy as far as you guys are appealing on one hand and then filing for a new trial on the other, and some of the evidentiary stuff you were talking about, how much of that you're able to bring in. So one, curious about that. And then also how Adnan's life has changed since the podcast and how it's affected his day-to-day life in prison and how he feels about everything.
Okay, so the legal strategy, on the legal front, there are really only two there's maybe three avenues. One is the post-conviction, which has been kind of ongoing since 2010. Right? We lost it, and then we filed an application for a new one, which was granted a couple months ago. The post-conviction can lead to basically a new trial. If we get to that point and we win here and then we win at the next, if we win here, they don't appeal it, or we win at the next level, we could get a new trial. In which case, I think the state would say, we're going to offer you a plea. I don't think they're going to go to court. Like, what do they have left, right? The second thing is the Innocence Project, which is also still part of the case. Like, they're still working with Adnan and investigating the case. And they're the ones who discovered that there's physical evidence that was never tested. Strategically, Adnan's post-conviction attorney is his lead counsel. And he decided that we're gonna follow the post-conviction to where it takes us. And if it takes us nowhere, then we're gonna go after the DNA. Because the truth is, we actually didn't think we were going to get granted a new post-conviction hearing. I mean, it was appeal. It's like in 2% of cases they do it. So we thought it'll be denied, and then we'll go for the DNA. And he's also, Justin Brown is his name. He's a very cautious person. Whereas me and Deirdre from UVA, we just want to go like full speed ahead. He's like, no, we got to like slow down. We got to take this one at a time. And he likes to think of all the different possibilities. Now, given the fact that that lawsuit, which was filed a couple of days ago, it's alleging, like, tampering with forensic evidence by the same detectives, it also makes me hesitate. I think about, this is DNA evidence that's been sitting in a police locker with the Baltimore City Police for 16 years. Like, how hard is it to put, like, somebody's DNA somewhere? I mean, like, what does it take? So it does make me nervous. But if we hit a wall, obviously we have to do that. So now, my part in all of this is, putting enough evidence in front of the public that it creates a lot of pressure on the state to say, this is making us look really bad, something went really bad here, we don't want to continue prosecuting this case. And so that's what I've been doing. That's like the third prong of it. But right now we're focused on the post-conviction, basically, and our private investigator's investigation. In terms of Adnan, he's received hundreds, maybe 500 or 600 letters in the last 6 months. He tried desperately to write back to everybody, like, by hand, and I think his fingers are broken at this point. So I don't know if he's abandoned or whatever. He doesn't have internet, obviously, so he can't listen to what's happening, but people have been sending him transcripts. He's never experienced social media. He has no idea, like, what it's like on Reddit or Twitter, or, I can explain these things, but I also have to weigh the fact that I don't want him to think that people have turned this into entertainment, right? That could be kind of hurtful. So he knows the popularity, because every so often he'll pick up a newspaper or magazine. Like, he found out the brief for the post-conviction was filed a few days ago, and he saw it on the news. That's how he knew it had been filed. And the guards have been listening to Serial and following along, so, which is kind of weird. So yeah, guards and other prison administrators have told him, yeah, we're listening, and a couple guards told him, man, you don't belong in here. So other than that, so he gets it, but he's been let down by the system a lot. He's hopeful, but he's cautiously hopeful. He literally in his head is like, it might take me another 10, 15 years to get out. I'm like, hell no, we're not going to wait that long. So.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about kind of how you convinced Sarah to do the podcast, or how you kind of got her hooked. And then also, I know you mentioned kind of a little bit back and forth how she did an amazing job and how it was great, but also how the podcast kind of missed out on a lot of key details, and how you view that contrast between, her indecisiveness, how she went about doing it, and, mass appeal versus very specific details.
I'm sorry, what was the first part of your question again?
How it all got started and kind of
how it all got started. Right, okay. Well, for years I had been thinking we should go to media. I would watch like Dateline in 2020. I'm like, yes, that's what we need. And we had the post-conviction hearing. Asia McClain had not shown up. Kevin Urich we know now, lied on the stand and said that she told him she was forced to make her documents. She was coerced to make them. So I already knew. I'm like, we were going to lose this post-conviction. We were waiting for the judge's orders, and I thought now is the time to get media involved, because what an investigative reporter can do is a lot different than what a lawyer can do. Like, lawyers have limited reach. People who are close to the parties have limited reach. I can't be knocking on like Jay Wilde's door, right? I can't be doing that. But investigative reporters can do all kinds of things, and they have tricks and they have leads. And I was really focused on finding somebody like a legal reporter or a crime reporter in Baltimore who was like seasoned, who knew everybody, who had snitches, who like had sources. And so one night I watched the last documentary about the West Memphis 3 case, which is just for your self-education. You should just watch these documentaries, because you will see how your own perception changes with just like media portrayal. It's remarkable. And I turned off the TV and I'm like, shoot, I gotta get a reporter on this. So I started looking for somebody who had written about the case in '99, and Sarah had written about it. She actually had written about Gutierrez in particular and her disbarment. So I tracked her down on the internet. I found out she worked for This American Life, and I'm like, well, I don't listen to This American Life. I don't really know if radio's the way to go, but I'll shoot her an email. I emailed her. The very next day I heard from her. And I emailed and I just said, listen, you reported on this case in 99. I believe it's a wrongful conviction. He's maintained his innocence. And I have all these documents I'd like to show. If you're interested, I'm looking for somebody who really wants to report on this case. And she was interested. She came to meet me within a week. In the first episode, what you hear is my first interaction with her and my brother too. And in which my brother says he's not a virgin. That shocked us all. He's not married yet, by the way. That's going to make it really hard for him to get married now. So Sarah was hooked. Sarah took those documents and she was hooked. But I have to admit that I was pretty skeptical because I was like, it's going to be like a 1 hour This American Life show, and how much is that really going to do for us? Like with this audience who's not connected to Baltimore. But we went with it, and after a couple months she told me they had hired an entire team to work on this. And then later she told me it's going to be like 10 shows. And I'm like, what is she talking about? Like, then she's like 12. But I had never heard a podcast before. And it wasn't until the day it launched that I knew what it was even called. So that's what happened.
So the podcast kind of paints this picture of two possibilities, that he's either lying or he's telling the truth. And if he's lying, he has the intelligence and capabilities to sustain this lie, and kind of, he's really smart and social, that he can kind of convince people that he's telling the truth and he's sincere when really he's not. So I want to know, what's your reaction to that? I know you kind of touched on it, but if you can go in a little more detail, and has your opinion that he is telling the truth ever wavered at all?
Okay, so I think Deirdre captured perfectly my reaction to this idea that Adnan is like this super manipulative, like, evil genius. I mean, if he was, he wouldn't be where he is, first of all. He would have at least had an alibi. He would have been like Asia McClain. He would have made sure that she appeared in trial. He wouldn't have just trusted his lawyer and been like, oh, okay, I guess she didn't check out. He's got to be the stupidest evil genius ever. But Deirdre's reaction was a sociopath. Like, you're not that lucky, Sarah. Like, they don't exist like that. I know Adnan is a human being, and I feel like it's really rare to encounter, I don't know, does it ever happen that you have somebody who's a criminal who has only one incidence of violence in their entire life? Like, in prison, in 16 years in prison as a young man, has never gotten into a fight? Like, that's how passive he is? Like, is that possible even? That he never snapped, that nobody has any, not a single person, like, could testify that he was ever aggressive towards Hae or to anybody, ever. And then there's the dichotomy of Dawn, right? Like, you have to ask, why didn't the police investigate Dawn the same way? That was her current boyfriend. He had been with her the night before. They had spoken till 3 a.m. He wasn't supposed to be working the next day, but he said he was at a different location, and his mother was his alibi. Dawn, in the police notes, had assaulted one of Hae's friends. Dawn, in his performance reports from work, showed that he had some aggression issues. So why Adnan instead of Dawn, right? And I think it was because Adnan fit a theory of the case, which was this honor killing and all this stuff. So that was a failure of police to investigate. I'm not suggesting that Dawn had anything to do with it. I'm just saying that it was the police didn't fully investigate what they could have investigated. And I totally forgot the question, so I don't know. I hope I've answered it. Did I answer it?
I just want to know
what I think. Okay.
You ever wavered in your opinion that
No, I didn't. But what was really interesting to me was, like, because the way Sarah presented the narrative, this is her job. She has to keep people hooked, right? And I get it. There are members of Adnan's family, his brothers, who were angry at the way she was, like, leaving people, like, maybe he did it, maybe he didn't every other week, but that was her job. She has no reason to put herself out there as somebody who has to think about her career, to advocate for somebody she's not quite sure 100%. But when Serial started and I started reading everything people were writing online, I just one time did kind of a thought exercise where I said, okay, imagine I don't know Adnan, and imagine, like, looking at all this through a very suspicious filter. Could I reach the same conclusion other people are? And I realized I could. I understand how people reach a certain conclusion. But that was based on Serial, not based on everything that Serial didn't cover. For me, it would take either a confession, honestly, or some real substantial evidence, actual evidence, like physical evidence. Jay is not enough for me.
So these will just be our last two questions.
Okay. First of all, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
I'm also not a law student. I'm an undergrad, so I am wondering. So I think that it seems like at this point, the way the trial is moving, that there's a possibility, and you've indicated this, that Adnan will be exonerated. And if that happens, what is the process like? Who do we turn to next? Who does Jay get in trouble for giving false testimony? What are the repercussions of this, and who will be affected that we heard in the storyline on the podcast? Who gets asked questions? Who gets brought to court? Does anyone get brought to court? What? Maybe Adnan isn't vindictive like this, but who's going to eventually
pay for it?
Or the detectives? Who's at fault here?
Yeah. One of the great problems, a systematic problem with the criminal justice system, is that there's very little accountability. In terms of police, prosecutors, people like that, there isn't a lot of accountability. So I wouldn't expect, also you have to first prove that it was intentional misconduct, right? Something was done really badly on purpose, to frame him or something. When in fact, a lot of times it's just poor performance that accounts for it. Having said that, I want Uric to lose his law license just for, preventing witnesses from testifying. And also for framing this all in an extremely bigoted way. I don't know if that'll happen, but there are, I'm sure some people will file some complaints against him with the Bar Association. If Adnan, look, if we ever get to the point, there's two possibilities. Either he's completely exonerated, means the state says he didn't do it, okay? In that case, the state has the option then to reopen the investigation and to revisit possible, suspects. They don't have to do it though. So that's up to them. Jay, on his hand, has actually violated the terms of his plea already. He's admitted to it. He violated the terms of his plea. This is another oddity. When Jay was on probation for 2 years, but during that time, he was arrested repeatedly for all kinds of different offenses, but he never spent a day in jail. Why? What's going on here? So that's up to the state. But if they offer Adnan a plea, if they say, listen, we don't want to go back to trial, we're going to offer him a plea. Usually these things are called Alford pleas. And it's a really weird legal fiction where you say, I plead guilty, but I'm really innocent. And the court allows it. And in that case, what happens is that Adnan is still held liable for her death. To them, it's a closed case. They don't go out, they don't reopen it, they don't prosecute anybody else. And I think it's kind of a sad ending for Hae and her family if that were to happen. It doesn't mean that if he were given an Alford plea and he took it, that people couldn't continue investigating, I'm sure Adnan will want to clear his name fully and continue investigating if we didn't have evidence by that time. So those are the options. It just depends on the state. If they want to, Jay is intimately connected, there's absolutely no reason they couldn't charge him with something, There's no double jeopardy or something like that that applies to Jay in this case. Last question.
Thanks for coming again. And I wanted to ask, since you know his family, I wanted to ask you about how his family, I guess, struggled with it. I mean, obviously they struggled with it through the years after the conviction until Serial happened. And what's it like?
What was it like for them? Yeah.
Yeah.
I think, it ruined his family. It totally destroyed his family. He had an older brother and a younger brother. His younger brother was 9 at the time Adnan was arrested. And, the case was it was a highly publicized case in Baltimore. There was a lot of pressure from the Korean American community. There were vigils. It was very public. There really was a lot of pressure on the police to do something. And it became about these 3, different communities kind of colliding. And so, his younger brother Yusuf would get picked on in school, and he would end up in fights and get kicked out. Finally, the family decided to send him to Pakistan, and they sent him to Pakistan, to a madrasa of all places, to a place where he couldn't speak the language and he didn't have any relatives, he didn't know anybody, because they never told the family. His parents, his mom and dad never told any of their own relatives in Pakistan, their own brothers and sisters and people, because they were so full of just shame. you know? And the community, especially after the conviction, up until the conviction, the community was really there, hard and strong. After the conviction, people were like, maybe he really did it. People didn't even understand why he was convicted. A lot of the kids didn't know what happened at the trial. So it was really hard on Yusuf, and I think it's damaged him a lot. I mean, I think a madrasa would damage a lot of people, but in that situation, when you're a young person in a country you don't speak the language, that was hard on them. So, and the older brother just couldn't handle it all. He just kind of left. He literally just disappeared. Like for years, his parents didn't know where he was. So that left his parents. And you know his parents. His mother, auntie, she's been like the pillar of strength here. But for years, she was on, antidepressants and, but she's an amazing, remarkable woman, and she's the only one who's held it together. His father just has no emotional ability to handle it. He's always withdrawn, he's not comfortable being social or talking about it. But one thing Serial has done is it's finally allowed the family to talk about it. Because the way our communities work is if your kid does something bad, like you just withdraw, like behind this veil of embarrassment. Nobody mentions it to you. You pretend like that person doesn't exist. And for 15 years, Adnan didn't exist anymore for people in the community and for his family. So this has allowed his family to finally talk about them, talk about him, talk about what they went through, and all the community support has really come back. So it's been good for them. So that's it.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you, everyone, obviously, that's listening online. I think we have a lot of people that are watching the live link. And Rabia, thank you so much for coming. I know it's so important for Adnan for you to be going around the country and talking to people about his case and sharing a side that Serial didn't show. And we owe you a lot. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here.